Now, why do people with intellectual disabilities die from preventable causes at more than twice the rate of the rest of the population? Could it be because of their interactions with our health system? That is one of the questions the Disability Royal Commission will be examining this week in its first formal hearings for the year. The focus will be on those with an intellectual disability or cognitive impairment such as brain injury. Now, Jack Kelly gave evidence today and said the healthcare system can make him feel like he is not valued as a person.
It makes me feel not that my voice in the healthcare system is not appreciated. I think sometimes, depending on the specialist or doctor, I think it's more like, oh, we've got a person with an intellectual disability or a person with a disability. Let's hurry up and let's get to somewhere. Let's get to a case where we can easily where they can easily understand us and we can easily understand them.
Now, Sam Connor, I know you've been following this very closely as always, and it was really startling just to repeat that statistic in another form, because Kate Eastman, the council today, in her opening address, pointed out that the mean age of death for people with intellectual disability or intellectual impairment for a man is 53 years, which is 25 years less than the general population. For a woman, 49. 36 less than the general population. What do you think is going on there? What's the core of the problem?
I think it's representative of the way that disabled people live. You know, we're forced into congregate environments like group homes. People have to share their care with other people. And, you know, quite often there's a lack of support for people to eat in time, or a lack of understanding about, you know, the way that people act when they get sick. And then when you get to the hospital, by which time it's often, you know, really too late, people don't necessarily understand the way we can communicate, and they don't value us as much as other people. So for people with intellectual disability and cognitive disabilities, it's magnified by, you know, dozens of times.
Can you give me an example of one of the problems with communication at hospitals or so on? Yeah.
Yeah, so a really easy one is that I'm a carer. I have a kid who's autistic, and part of our communication as autistic people is that we're quite often very literal. My kid went into the hospital with an anaphylactic shock, and the doctor said, you know, is your chest tight? And he said no, because he didn't know what that meant. And so that's a really basic example. If you don't use spoken language at all, then you probably need to have a diagnostic test, you know, to see whether you've got broken bones, or, you know, to understand what's going on with your body. And quite often people don't actually listen to that person and understand the way that that person's behaving.
So what language did he respond to in that case?
I came in and said, does it feel like a cat sitting on your chest? And he said, yes. So,
right.
You know, so it's really about, you know, I communicate in that way too, but I'm a bit older and have worked out how to, you know, communicate with those neurotypicals. So it's a thing that's really common for autistic people, that we have 85% co-occurring mental health conditions, and quite often we end up in psych wards where people quite often die. There's, you know, really they're inhospitable environments for us. So for anybody with, you know, dementia, for older people, you hear reports of this all the time, that people, you know, don't have good experiences in hospitals, and I think we just need to get better at that.
Right, and your experience would show how dependent people can be on having their carer, their primary carer, who does understand and can communicate. Which places probably an extra burden and responsibility on that relationship. Look, for more, we're joined in Canberra by the CEO of the Disability Leadership Institute, Christina Ryan. Now, her organisation aims to develop and support leaders with disabilities. Welcome to the Drum, Christina.
Thanks, Julia.
Now, we hear that one of the fundamental issues in terms of preventable, you know, deaths and certain health outcomes for people with intellectual disabilities is the question of communication. How can we be certain at this Royal Commission those people will be heard?
Fundamentally, we can't. The Commission started pretty badly, and it wasn't listening to disabled people. It's done a lot of work since. I think, you know, people like Sam, myself and many others have been out there making it clear that disabled people need to be front and centre, and they need to be witnesses. So there has been a lot of work done there. And It is a reflection more of the broader problem we have with the community generally, who just don't take the time to listen to people who communicate differently, a bit like Sam was just outlining. And what that really means is when somebody is trying to raise a concern, they're going not just through gatekeepers, particularly if they're in a segregated environment like group housing or a sheltered workshop or something like that. They have to go through gatekeepers to get to the outside world. They then have to actually have people who are prepared to listen to them. And what we often find is people are turning up at hospitals. I've known people who've been sent away because they didn't bring their guardian with them, when in fact they didn't have a guardian. So the assumption that people with cognitive impairment or intellectual disabilities, and there's a plethora of these, it's a very broad church, the assumption that these people are all highly dependent and actually come with somebody who will speak for them is erroneous. It's also really disempowering and demeaning to assume that that person must be spoken for. We are really bad at allowing people to make their own decisions and to articulate for themselves what is going on. And so in some ways our systems and processes have never bothered to even learn how to listen to people who communicate differently. And I think this is a symptom of that larger problem in some ways, and the life expectancy rates are one example. The numbers of preventable deaths is even more of an example. The figures are quite shocking. When I first saw them years ago, I assumed it was a national figure I was looking at just in passing. Later that day, when I drilled a bit deeper and had more time to look at the New South Wales Ombudsman's report, it became clear it was only figures for New South Wales.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, this is appalling. This is what's contributing to this life expectancy rate, and it's also what's contributing to the need for a Royal Commission in the first place. The systemic barriers, the fact that these systems just, in some ways, they don't put the time and effort into supporting the actual people that they're there to support.
Right, and if I can, the figure that I have here that you're referring to, which is just from New South Wales and Victoria, is showing up to 50% of deaths of people with intellectual disability are potentially avoidable, against 17% for the rest of the population, which is absolutely enormous. Now, if I can just bring the rest of the panel in here. Greg, can I go to you? And one of the things that Kate Eastman said today is that some doctors don't even greet patients with an intellectual disability when they come into their offices. The stigma is so great, or the misunderstanding or miscomprehension from the medical community is so great. What do you think we do about that?
Well, Julia, I think this is a really profound ethical failing of our society. We don't properly value handicapped life. I think this is indeed about relativising human nature. And it starts from the beginning of life and goes through to the end of life. There is a sense that that handicapped life is somehow or other inferior to healthy life, and I'm not really that critical of the health profession because they're so understaffed and overstressed, but we do need protocols and learning. But our society spends money on all kinds of rubbish, but if giving proper support to people who are a bit different in their method of communication or their ability to look after themselves ought to be the very highest priority for our society.
Christina, to that issue of the medical community and the responsibility of doctors, I understand that the average medical degree has about 2.6 hours over several years devoted to intellectual disability, and with nursing it's 0 hours. Surely that's a very basic point we can start from.
That's a pretty basic thing. I think we need to be really careful here about suggesting that there's something going on in health that isn't happening more widely. We need to be aware that this is actually a bigger problem. We also need to be aware it's not just happening in Australia. So we're having a Royal Commission, so this particular week we're talking about the health system and how that's not responding well, particularly to people with cognitive impairment. The health system isn't responding well to disabled people generally, as it happens. And it's also broader systems. They're built to respond generically. You can't really respond to people generically. but particularly people with disabilities. You know, we are all different. We have specific things. Even people with the same label on their condition have particularly different needs. So, you know, autism's a great example of that. You know, one autistic person is vastly different to another autistic person. And so we need to be really careful about thinking that this is specifically about health. It isn't. It is more about, as that guy was saying in the story earlier, you know, it's about being valued by the community. It's about the way the community broadly engages with disabled people. We're still shoved off in institutional care in segregated environments, so that gives us a little bit of an indicator about how much we're valued. We're often assumed to be going places. We're never out without our carer, when in fact only a small proportion of disabled people have a carer on a regular basis. Many of us need assistance from day to day to do some things, but most of us actually get by in our daily lives without having somebody around us all the time, including people with cognitive disability. We don't need our decisions made for us. And in some ways, Australia is actually behind the 8 ball in one big way. We don't actually employ disabled people in this country. We're well at the back of the pack as far as the OECD is concerned. And what that actually means is that in none of these systems, in none of these places, are there any disabled people in roles of decision making. Nobody's actually there making the decisions or designing the systems and cultures of those places who has any experience of disability other than remotely, other than as a third party, including the main policy department in this country that looks after disability. There is not one single disabled person in their executive level staff.
Okay,
that's
amazing.
It's really where the problem is sitting. Nobody running the disability services, the support services, is disabled. Very few disabled people sitting on the boards of those services. So this is telling us why the system is broken. We need to somehow, in some ways, I think that's what the Royal Commission needs to be looking at, rather than tinkering around the edges saying we should all be much nicer to disabled people because that'll be the answer.
Right. Christine, how do you think we shift those cultural attitudes? I mean, I even, on a very small element, you know, someone close to me who lost the ability to speak, who, you know, being in a wheelchair, I noticed people's attitudes changing, the way they spoke to her, their voices getting louder, and the assumption that, you know, like, I actually couldn't believe how dramatic that shift was. Is something about the way people behave to those who cannot communicate easily.
Yeah,
that's problematic.
Yeah, and these disabled people, I think, really truly are the quietest Australians who really don't have their voices heard. And I mean, it's an eye or an ear opener to me to hear that there aren't disabled people in the very highest levels of the bureaucracy that are making decisions for disabled. I mean, that's just all wrong.
Can I just chip in? Just with, you know, people can make change on a local level. You know, so there's organisations like the New South Wales Council for Intellectual Disability that are putting together easy English packs for disabled people to be able to take into their health professionals. There's, in my area, the Wheatbelt Health Network has, you know, a whole easy English you know, library. They have rooms that are, you know, waiting rooms for people who don't tolerate noise well. So I think there's a lot of change happening locally because people, you know, but not systemically at a higher level, like Christina's saying.
But also, I mean, workplaces are the, you know, that's a really crucial place to start. If workplaces can be diverse and inclusive genuinely for disabled people, then that's what opens people's eyes and ears and hearts to the fact that these are ordinary people that might have particular problems or disabilities, but they are just human beings like everybody else, and their voices should be heard. And listening to this discussion, I just hope that the Royal Commission will be a constructive process and a productive process so that those people who haven't been heard, who've been hidden away or institutionalised and in, as I understand, often very unsuitable, you know, you've got young people in aged care facilities and you know, places that just don't, you know, aren't going to give the best provision of quality of life to people who are disabled. I hope the Royal Commission comes up with some answers and some solutions and makes a difference.
Right. Sam, can I ask you about something else? Because I know that you have strong views on this. The Commission heard today from a woman called Kylie Scott, I think, who lives with Down syndrome, and she was talking about the importance of the doctor-patient relationship. And she also said if prenatal screening is used to terminate kids with Down syndrome, she doesn't want that to continue. Do you think that's going to be a discussion that will ensue from this Commission?
Oh, very close to my heart, because I have a grandchild and I have a daughter who's pregnant at the moment, who said to me, she went to a public hospital and they very heavily encouraged her to have prenatal screening, and she said, no, you know, I don't care if the kid's disabled. But there's a lot of parents, you know, a lot of people make their choices based on ignorance, because disabled people aren't in community and they don't know what the life of a person with Down syndrome looks like, because they're not working alongside of them, you know. So I think, you know, having people working alongside of you, being in community, changes your attitudes. And I can tell when people have a disabled person in their life or family. It's really obvious to me, because their attitude is actually quite different, as you said, Julia.
It's transformative. Christina, what are your hopes for the Commission? It's day one today.
Yeah, well, it's you know, we had a couple of hearings last year which, you know, weren't great. Now, you know, they're getting better now. I guess the real thing is we want disabled people to be heard directly.
Yes.
You know, to actually be valued, to have our voices as the voices that matter. You know, there are plenty of people who have a stake in the lives of disabled people, but they are not us. And they aren't the people who are being denied decision making. They're not the people who are being segregated into environments which have endemic levels of violence. They're not the people who are being denied healthcare because nobody has the time to communicate with them, or feels that they're whinging or malingering. So it is actually about listening to disabled people. It's about lifting this really unpleasant rock, which is what the Commission is doing, and having a look underneath and recognising that until we are able to control and run our own lives, until we are the people who are our own agents, we've got a problem. And so for me, the big outcome is to see that suddenly, and it's not going to be sudden, it could, you know, hopefully we'll all still be alive when this happens, but we need to be seeing people in the public domain. Disabled people historically have been hidden away. It's a very Victorian era response to disability, and it's still what is the most common response. Hide people away, be embarrassed that we exist. As Sam says, it's really easy to spot people who know disabled people and simply have this as part of their lives. And so that sense that we can be decision makers. You know, I'm a CEO, Sam is out there on, you know, on a prominent commentator on a regular basis.
On the drum, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. But in other domains as well. And it's, you know, it's really important that it's recognised that, hey, you know, why are we unusual? How often do you have two disabled people on the panel, for example? You know, that's pretty unusual. It's not
Sometimes,
happening.
yes.
We've got one person in our federal parliament and nobody in our cabinet. We've got one Minister for Disability who is openly disabled in this country, and that's only quite recently. So the people with the purse strings, the people making the policy and money decisions, we need to be in those rooms. We can't constantly be tapping on the door politely asking. We need to be in those rooms. And for me, that's the biggest outcome of the Royal Commission, is knowing that the structures and the processes, the culture won't shift until that happens.
Christina, you do important work. We appreciate you sharing your expertise with us this evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Christina Ryan, she's the CEO of the Disability Leadership Institute.